Hello, John Richter here from Financial Mechanics, and welcome to this next episode in your T201 Project Finance course, where we're going to take a look at the topic of debt repayment sculpting. Or as I've stated here in this somewhat cryptic subtitle, we're going to maximize the minimum DSCR. And hopefully what we mean by that will become clear by the time we get to the end of the episode. So to start with, we should remind ourselves of the basic debt service cover ratio relationship, the relationship of cash flow available for debt service to debt service in any given period. So you'll remember we can look at a chart of those ratios over time and get some sort of idea of the general buffer or headroom or cushion that the banks have, reminding ourselves also that we're talking about cash flows here. And a way to think of the minimum DSCR is as effectively a pinch point, the point at which the banking cover ratios or the extra cushion that the banks have is at its smallest point, and therefore you might argue the point of highest risk. So banks might be very motivated to only lend an amount of money such as to ensure that the minimum DSCR does not fall below some threshold that they might have as part of their banking criteria. And it might be useful to try to make that minimum DSCR as high as possible. And looking at the relationship here on the screen, we can't directly influence the waterfall coming to the bank's property, meaning the cash flow in the river at that point. So cash flow available for debt service is nothing we can influence directly. Also, interest payments are a function of a sort of set interest rate and the brought forward balance for that period. So at that point in time, the balance is set, so we can't directly manipulate interest. But in any given period, we can influence the principal payments. We can set percentages subject to the restriction, of course, that repayment schedule adds up to 100%, that we're fully paying off the debt. But in any given period, we have some flexibility to modify the amount of principal paid and therefore influence the debt service cover ratio. And that lies at the heart of the principle of sculpting. So with that by way of a quick introduction, why don't we hop over to our model and see how this strategy of manipulating principal repayments might play out in practice. So here we've loaded our model to the input S sheet, the series input sheet, where amongst other things we have a set of repayment profiles from which we're currently selecting the first repayment profile via this switch. And I have a DSCR chart in the second window, which I'll just flip to, which reminds us of the current profile of debt service cover ratios that we have based upon that selection of the 20-year level repayment profile, which means effectively 2.5% each period for 40 periods, i.e. 20 years. Now, what I've done is I've set up a kind of a dummy test variable profile here in position 4, just to sort of demonstrate the point that, of course, we can type in any percentages we want, subject to the primary restriction that whatever set of percentages we set up adds up to 100%. And generally, the banks being sensitive to the overall length of the repayment term. In this particular example, we've been focused on a 20-year term debt. So if we look at the profile that is created by selecting that sort of test profile that I have set up there, do a full recalc of the model. Actually, why don't I hop over to the current profile, do a full recalc so we can stare at that chart. We see that I haven't sculpted very well. We've got a lot of peaks and valleys, and we got a particularly ugly one out here, it looks like, here at kind of column 26, which is underwater, at least the cover ratio is below 1, and some high ones. Obviously this fellow here being the highest, this one being kind of close by, that's quite high as well. And in concept, what I could do is imagine that I might be able to cut and take and borrow from those positions that have high ratios and somehow use that excess capacity to pay less principal and raise these cover ratios. So if you will, paying less principal and reducing debt service to raise these ratios by paying more principal in other areas such that the overall schedule still adds up to 100%, and kind of cutting and chopping and trial and error at some level, and you might imagine we get some sort of general average based upon these areas that would fall probably below 2, just eyeballing this, but likely above 1.5. So somewhere along here we might be able to get all the ratios to kind of converge on that point. So that could be a painful process. If I flip over and look at 23 versus 26, I can kind of see how that might work in kind of a manual sense anyway. So let me go out and use, let's see, 23. We aren't paying anything currently in 23, so we have a grace period on principal repayments, and this explains why we're have a pretty poor ratio in 26, because we're paying 6% of the total debt as principal repayment. So that has pushed up the debt service in that period and therefore reduced the ratio to the extent the CFADs between these two positions is not radically different. So you might imagine I'd kind of borrow 3% from there and kind of apply it here. So reducing 3%, and I'll just kind of use some indicator shade here to sort of indicate that what I've done is changed the 6% and kind of shifted 3% of it over. If I look back now at my chart and do a full recalc, we can kind of see that I might be making progress. Okay, so I've raised that minimum. So now the minimum is probably sitting over here, and I could, so to speak, borrow excess capacity from some of these other peaks and areas and apply them to these low periods. And eventually I'd get there. But of course, this is just to demonstrate the concept. This is not going to be our strategy. We're going to let Excel do the hard work for us by following some basic arithmetic and what I've called here in the slides an algebraic script. So we start on the basis that the debt service cover ratio, DSCR, is equal to cash flow available for debt service, CFADs, divided by debt service. So that's simple. And I can rearrange terms to re-express that as target debt service. So here I'm introducing the idea that it's our kind of hoped for debt service would equal to the CFADs divided by, again, the idea of a target debt service cover ratio. And that last element here would be something I might want to make all ratios the same. If I make all ratios the same, I've effectively gotten to that sculpted position I'm looking for. I've effectively maximized the minimum ratio. So that would be our first step in the process if I hop over to the model and execute that. So we'll flip back to the model area and go to our senior debt sheet here and see that we've got a fairly straightforward principal repayment calculation section, which relies on bringing in this input series repayment profile, which I'm going to mark. I'm not going to mark it yellow. I'm going to mark it sort of green to highlight the fact that currently we're bringing in what effectively is a set of saved inputs. So I'm going to relabel that to the selected. So this is the selected saved senior debt repayment profile. Now I may revisit that label here in a second. So the idea that I'm trying to get here is that this is, yes, the senior debt repayment profile, but this is based upon saved selection. So this is what is selected from stored inputs to highlight what it is we're talking about by that fellow. So I've just inserted a bunch of rows, and I'm going to start myself off with a target DSCR guess, I'll say, which I'm just going to say is halfway between that 1.5 and the 2.0 based upon eyeballing that cover ratio chart. So I'm just jamming in an input here, which is a ratio. So you can remind ourselves of the sort of picture that we've got. I'm not expecting this is going to be an accurate guess. I'm just sort of chucking in a number that's somewhere in the hunt. There's certainly ratios above 1.75 and there's certainly ratios below. So with that in place, we can now take a look at cash flow available for debt service, but restricted over the debt term. So we're only allowing cash flow available for debt service that is within the current 20-year range, which we calculated in a previous episode to come up with our weighted average and debt service cover ratio, and therefore we have this ingredient here, CFADs over debt term. And I'll just link to that, creating a counterflow import. So let me go ahead and mark that up and go ahead and mark this fellow as an export. So this was just simply calculated by looking at CFADs and restricting it over the term of the debt by using the flag. And I'll hop back to the senior debt sheet, and this effectively gets us this idea of target debt service. So if we want to achieve a 1.75 ratio in every period, we'd better have debt service equal to the number I'm just calculating, which is the CFADs divided by that target DSCR guess. So I can shoot that across. And that is kind of step one of the algebraic script that we're walking through here. Now with target debt service in place, we now get to the next step. So I'll hop over the slides and take a look at that. And what I mean by that is if we have target debt service, we can then come up with something I'll call target principal by simply subtracting or backing out the interest, which, as we touched on a little bit earlier, is effectively preset because it's based upon the brought forward balance. So yes, it's influenced by previous principal repayments, but once we get to a particular period, we can't mess with the interest expense calculation. At that point in time, interest is going to be kind of set. So let's go ahead and get that next step done by hopping back to our model, where I will somewhat pedantically call up target debt service just from above and subtract interest expense. So I'll indicate that I'm going to use the positive form of interest expense here to get target principal repayment. So that's the logic script in place on my screen. I'll shoot these ingredients across and just do a simple A minus B and see what the total is based upon a 1.75 for a current guess. I'll go ahead and add those up. We see some interesting effects at one level. One thing that we see is that with a 1.75 ratio, we're paying off 242,006, at least as the numbers are set up on the screen. We're not adequately or not completely paying off debt if I'm to believe these numbers, because we have to pay off 316.3 million euros, which will get us to the next part of the algebraic script coming up, which is to say if we have that target principal, we can divide it back by the initial debt balance to come up with a percentage in each period that will pay that amount of principal and therefore that amount of target debt service and achieve the target DSCR. So that last, or the third of our steps so far, would be to simply calculate a set of percentages consistent with the initial debt balance. So let's get that done. So that'll be pretty straightforward. I'll go ahead and take a copy of this ingredient we're using down here. Here's our target principal, which I'll call up, link to, and come up with a sculpted repayment profile. I'm going to call this live. This is a live calculated value based upon current CFAD. So that's B divided by A. In fact, just like that first calculation block. So here is a set of percentages, and this makes it more clear on a couple fronts. What we've got, we're only adding up to 76.51%. If I chart that for what it's worth, one of the other features that we see is we've got quite a few negative values here at the front. Itself problematic, but I'm not going to trap or test for that just yet. That's a somewhat more advanced effort. So for now, we're just kind of letting that happen. Negative principal repayment effectively acting as the opposite of a normal principal repayment in the sense that we're able to reduce debt service even further. So here's a live calculation where clearly the intent will be to try to get that 76.51% to 100%. And because we're not paying off all the debt, that suggests we're aiming too high, that we can't support 1.75 in every period. So maybe we could only support 1.6. And you can start to see just at a very simple level what's happening. When I try 1.6 and just do a Shift F9, it climbs to 93.05% in total. But of course, the key thing right now is that we're not even using this repayment profile that we've just calculated. We're still linked back to the saved set of inputs. So one of the things that's useful to do with these debt sculpting setups is to put in a switch that allows you to choose either the saved values or kind of the live calculated value. And that has usefulness for a number of different reasons, which we can talk about later. So what I'm going to do now is to set up a use live sculpted profile switch. I'm typing very well. So when it's a 1, we'll use the live profile, 0 otherwise. So we'll go ahead and just kind of keep that as an input for now here. So 0 will be choosing this fellow. So I'll take a copy of that. And if it's 1, we'll go ahead and pick the live profile. And the result of that operation we will call the, let's say, the active senior debt repayment profile. So that's the one that's currently being, so to speak, used in the model. So if that switch is equal to 1, different ways you could write this or set this formula up. We'll go ahead and take the live sculpted value. Otherwise, we'll pick the saved fellow. So that effectively activates and chooses with the simple if statement, flips on and uses the active, uses the live calculation, chooses it as the active. So that will now become the ingredient that we use in our fundamental calculation here, what used to be the selected input series from input S. So now we're choosing one which is no longer an import. So that's just pointing to the result of that effort, and it's now this fellow coming in, which I'll no longer leave green, that's coming in from the input S sheet. Now clearly 28.41% is a disaster. We've just done a Shift F9. If I do a full recalc of the model just to sort of see how things shake out completely, we're at 47.98%. So clearly hopeless. No way we can support a 1.6. Can we support 1.5? A lot closer. Can we support 1.45? Can we support 1.4? Yeah, better than 1.4, 1.42. And you could imagine you could kind of sit here and guess all day, and after a few efforts, you get kind of close. We're at 100.79%, but of course not bang on and a little bit painful to want to do that. So that then brings us to the obvious possibility of using the Excel goal seek. So what we're going to do now is set up something I'm going to call somewhat ugly label. Let's see, amplified set cell delta. Let's see, amplified set cell delta equals to 0. So what I'm going to do will be more obvious, I think, when I do the math here than from that label. But I'm going to set up a cell that we're going to make equal to 0. And what that fellow is first off the sum, and I'm just out of habit not going to point at a display total. So here's the total repayment profile, currently 100.79%. Just adding up that row of the live calculation. Okay, we might even consider taking this actually up here and just operating on the live number rather than encumbering that. So let me go ahead and change my mind there a little bit. Let's put it directly on this fellow here, the live calculation, not this sort of resultant fellow. So that's pointing at the live calculation. That -1 should be 0. And GoalSeek likes to kind of hunt for bigger numbers. So one of the things you often do with GoalSeeks to kind of make them perform better, which is a topic for a kind of a broader discussion, is to increase their size. And here I'm multiplying this component that should be equal to 0 by 10 to the 6th with this somewhat complicated looking formula, but it's not that bad. So currently it's at 7,913, and that's the set cell. We want to make that 0, because if that's 0, that means this profile is equal to 100% quite closely. And we could make it 10 to the 8th. I'm not sure you want to do that. The key point I want to make here is you do not change your internal iteration settings within your Excel environment, because that won't be transportable or portable with your model. So what we're going to do is we're going to make that cell 0 by changing our ratio. So if I do a GoalSeek, Tools GoalSeek, set that cell to 0 by changing this fellow, Excel will do the hunting and pecking. And we could rock and roll on that, get something very close to 0 on the set cell, and that means by definition this fellow is very close to 100%. And that is currently being used. And what that would suggest is that all the ratios are at 1.4225. You get the idea. A lot of decimals. We hope to sort of achieve that because this, in all its glory, was established by Excel. So within our ability to read the chart, 1.4225 should be what I see when I flip to the DSCR chart. So I flip over to that, and we seem to have achieved an outcome where we've sculpted the repayment profile over 20 years to achieve flat cover ratios. And by doing so, we have made the minimum cover ratio as big as it can be under these current conditions. Any further manipulation of the repayment profile will cause one of these fellows to go up a little bit and somewhere else one or more to go down. And if any of them go down from here, the minimum will be lower than it is currently. Effectively, the minimum is currently equal to the average. And in fact, if we hop back to the main part of the model and look at our ratios page, we'll see that sort of in the numbers. That our minimum of the 6-month HDSCRs, just to kind of show the resolution here, is 422,455, as is the simple average. That makes sense, right? If all the ratios are the same, which is not the best ratio, but it turns out also that the weighted average, which we looked at earlier as the appropriate way to look at things, is also at that number. So one of the setups that causes the simple average to be the same as the weighted average is a scenario where all ratios are the same. And as you can expect, the historical kind of looking over 12-month periods are not any different. So they also set themselves up at that sculpted position. So that's the sort of guts of the logic that achieves our result. Reminding ourselves, going back to the senior debt sheet, that we are currently kind of set with this switch to calculate a live ratio, which is being used. That runs itself into the model, and we can then activate and use the GoalSeek. So now I have a profile, the live calculation, which has gotten the job done. And one of the last steps you might do is to kind of take a look at it for purposes of saving it as one of the input profiles. So what I'm going to do is a couple manipulations on it that relate to being careful about Excel's resolution and your display resolution as to what kind of decimalization, how many decimal points are you going to kind of present or advertise or report to the lawyers to put in the loan agreement for a repayment profile. So here's our live calculation. I'm going to go ahead and calculate something I'm going to call the rounded version. So this is the rounded version. You'll see what I'm up to here in a second, where my objective is to be to avoid pasting something that's going to be kind of like numbers like this fellow here with 15 significant figures. I want to have something that's nice and clean, that is the number of digits that I expect the lawyers to type into the loan agreement. To do that at one level, I'm going to go ahead and do a round on this fellow, comma 5. 5 actually, because I want to do 3 decimal places of percentages. So that requires 5 off the integer, and we'll sort of see what that looks like. If I do percent style and add 4 decimals, you can see each time I get a 0 in that last place. Okay, so basically all I've got is 3 decimal places of resolution, and if I were to add that up, we might see in here it looks like we're lucky, okay, that it added up to 100%, but that will not always be the case. Sometimes you get like 99.98%. So we just happen to be lucky that this fellow worked out with the rounding. So often what you'll do is take a look in the last period and kind of true things up to 100% in the last period of the debt repayment. Kind of make that last number equal to 1 minus the percentages that you've come up with to that point. Not sure if we have that flag just yet, but for now I'm just going to go ahead and, as I usually do, last senior debt repayment date flag. Make sure I got last senior debt repayment date flag. Of course this will be a hack, and I will mark it and just put a 1 in out there on the last fellow. And what I'm going to do now is to calculate a paste, sort of a copy target. Maybe copy is good. So this is the one I'm going to copy, and then we're going to take a look at where we'll paste it. We'll obviously paste it into the so you might even say copy target, so there's no confusion. So this is the target of my copying, and what that's going to be is if the flag is equal to 1, we're going to go ahead and just calculate the difference between 100%, if you want, rather than a 1. I'll just make it clear. 100% minus the sum of all of the percentages that have occurred before. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do that round fellow that we had in the previous step. So my idea here, of course, will be to anchor this. So if I don't anchor that $ on the I, it won't hold on to it. So here's what some modelers call a semi-anchored range, which I don't do very often. This gives me a target for copying in order to not have too much resolution into my inputs, and we'll sort of see how that works. I'm going to go ahead and export this fellow back to the input S sheet. I don't have space for it just yet. I could put it underneath. It's probably not the worst idea. So that's an imported counterflow for what it's worth in all its glory. I could even see that it's got a bunch of zeros. And my idea here is to potentially add another row. It looks like I've got a yellow row in already. That didn't have to be there. The way this fellow works is it's designed to stretch. So I insert a row, that index stretches, so now my 5th alternative of a repayment profile, I will say, is a 20-year sculpted senior debt repayment profile. So my idea is to take a selection of this fellow. This is my rounded, trued up schedule, and paste special value in here. You could clear out these hyphens. I sometimes do that, and you can see if I march across here, if you look up in the edit pane just to sort of prove to yourself, 1.005, each one of these is only 3 decimals at most. Of course, I could increase the decimals on this row as well, and you'll see zeros sitting on each one, however you choose to look at that. But the idea is that I now have a clean schedule. I don't think I need that green left there anymore. That was for demonstration. I started out with the 0, I think it was 0 there, and then 6 here. In any event, we have now a saved copy of the profile that we generated, that we derived from the algebra, sitting now in position 5. So I ought to be able to do two things. One, hop back, pick 5 as the saved switch, and then you'll remember we need to effectively deactivate the using the live. Okay, so if I do now a full recalc of the model, I'm pulling in from the saved selection the sculpted profile, but I'm not using it until I deactivate this switch. So now I'm using the saved profile, and that, if you will, is locked down potentially as a base case, and I could run sensitivities from here. But I should see no change in the DSCR by using that saved one. That rounding and everything else should have very little influence on actually outturn ratios. So I've done a full recalc of the model, and I've seen no shift in that fundamental sculpting that's now in place. So those last steps we went through were simply to come up with a means and a method to save a copy of the sculpted profile so that now I can run sensitivities, change things about my revenue profile, and not expect that the profile is going to adjust itself to the changes associated with those input changes. So that is pretty much it. Just to recap on the last steps that we made, we effectively used the goal seek to iterate the target DSCR to 0. I.e. make the target repayment profile add up to 100%. And as I've said here, goal seek is as good as anything else. We could have used macros, but generally speaking, if you don't have to use macros, there's limited value in kind of setting those up and maintaining them and showing people how to use them. But it does depend. If you want to set things up for user friendliness, sometimes macros can be helpful, but they're just a little bit more involved for the modeler to maintain and manage. And that is pretty much the story for today. We've set up and derived a repayment profile that gets all our periodic cover ratios to the same number, and therefore we maximized the minimum ratio. Bye for now.